Xin chào mừng quý vị và các bạn quay trở lại với phần 2 của chương trình Tôi và Việt Nam trên kênh truyền hình FBNC, phỏng vấn giáo sư Edmund Malesky đến từ trường Đại học Đức, Hoa Kỳ về chỉ số năng lực cạnh tranh cấp tỉnh của Việt Nam, hay còn gọi tắt là PCI. Chúng tôi xin phép được tiếp tục cuộc trò chuyện với vị khách mời này. So I believe that the idea of PCI did face a lot of opposition. What were the arguments against it?
There were many. I think we can put them into four little baskets. Okay, so basket number one is just it's strange for someone else to come and rank you on your job, right? Like, so the students sometimes provide student evaluations, and sometimes I disagree with the students. I say, wait, that's totally not fair. I put so much work into that lecture. Or how can you rank me low because you didn't like my tie, right? So I understand it's not fun to be ranked, and so there was that first thing was just, who are you to tell me how I am at my job? And there was some pushback there, and I get that. But I think the goal was always to try and help them. And once leaders understood that the goal was not just the ranking, but to provide opportunities for them to see how they could improve, that changed. The second one was misunderstanding about methodology. So the PCI is built on a random survey of businesses. And because of that, we don't need to ask a lot of firms to be able to understand and represent the community. Because it's a random selection, I sometimes explain it's a little bit like a bowl of pho. If I mix that bowl of pho up, I only need to eat 1 or 2 bites to know what the pho tastes like. I don't need to eat the whole bowl. And so, but a lot of leaders had trouble with that idea. So they would say, look, I have 3,000 businesses in my province, but you only surveyed 300. How can you know about the business community in my province when I have 3,000? And so we had to do a little bit of just explaining how the methodology worked and how random sampling worked to try and help them understand that we were pretty rigorous. And I think once we explained that, they realized that 300 randomly sampled firms is actually quite a lot. And that it's a very different from sometimes the 3 or 4 firms that they were actually talking to regularly about the business environment. So that was the second basket, which is just kind of methodological understanding and pushback until they could get that. And the third basket of criticisms are sometimes from Vietnamese policymakers and intellectuals, and I think, and the criticism here I disagree with, and so I'll just say that I entirely disagree with it. And that criticism has been that the PCI creates negative competition, that the PCI incentivizes provinces to compete against each other, which has bad repercussions for Vietnam as a whole. And I think what they have in mind when they say that is that, for example, provinces feel incentivized to both create deep water ports or to both create industrial zones, even though they should share those resources. Right? Similarly, they think they're competing to make regulation and taxes as low as possible. But as we just explained, that's not what the PCI is measuring. We're not measuring infrastructure. We're measuring governance, right? We're measuring transparency. If provinces both compete to be the most transparent province and provide the most information on budgets and plans, that's a good thing for the country. There's no negativity to that competition. And so I think that criticism is really coming from people who haven't taken a very close look at our methodology. The fourth one is that the fourth criticism we've got is we sometimes venture into some pretty sensitive territory. We want to ask tough questions because our goal is to help Vietnam develop, and that means asking hard questions about things that aren't working. And so we've looked at issues like bribery, and we've looked at issues like transfer pricing, and we've done rigorous research on that because we're trying to provide information. But when you do that, it's possible that some people don't like what you're uncovering or what you're saying, and so we've had some discussions where people have pushed back against our findings. We've stuck by our evidence. And what's interesting is what I really like about working in Vietnam is that when you do stick by strong, rigorous scientific evidence, people tend to accept it. Even people that don't like the findings, that they may push back at first, but eventually they end up liking it and using that information. And that's something that's been true about Vietnam that I haven't seen in other countries where we've done indexes like this.
Did you ever think that you would take this idea to another country instead of Vietnam?
So I have now. Yeah. So we've tried it in a number of other countries now. So some in the region like Cambodia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka,
Ooh.
and now even in other continents now. So we've done one in El Salvador and Kosovo, and we're planning to move the index now to Laos and Myanmar. So those are the next places that we'll do it. So yeah, no, it's Vietnam was the first, and Vietnam is the longest, but the methodology's caught on in other places. What I will say is that I think I will say this. I think for a variety of reasons, including the important role of VCCI in using the index, including what I'll say is the incredible numeracy of Vietnamese, that Vietnamese politicians and business people, they like numbers and they like hard data, so that numeracy has led to it. It's been much more successful in Vietnam than any other place.
I see.
Yeah, in terms of how newspapers use it, in terms of how leaders use it, we haven't been able to replicate the success, even though we've replicated the methodology. Yeah.
PCI has been changed over time. In 2009, the factor of favoring state-owned enterprises was dropped. In 2013, the factor of fair competition was added. So what were the reasons? Was the environment changed, or the PCI itself was incomplete?
Okay, so this is a great question. You've definitely done your research. So this is 100% true. I sometimes say the 2009 decision was probably my biggest mistake, and not just as the PCI, but as an analyst of Vietnam. So this is a little bit boring and kind of geeky, but you asked the question, so you're getting it, right? So what happened was that the original measure was biased towards the local state-owned enterprise sector. Not all state-owned enterprises, just local. And for the similar reasons we talked about, we wanted to focus on what provincial officials could control, and they weren't controlling central investment decisions. But there had been a huge effort to equitize and liquidate those small local private enterprises, right? So we were visiting some provinces that didn't have any local state-owned enterprises anymore. They only had utilities at that point. And it didn't make sense to rank provinces based on something that didn't exist anymore. So we decided to get rid of that index. What I didn't understand at the time was that now the important role that these large conglomerates and central state-owned enterprises would play, right? This is, Venetian would start its expansion right about this time, right? So you would see they would move out into these locations and have small branches. And so even though there wasn't a bias towards the local state-owned enterprise sector, there was a bias towards the central state-owned enterprise sector. The second thing was that we started to notice bias towards formerly state companies. They were equitized, they were no longer officially state, but they still had a lot of relationships with the local government that helped them do things that other competitors could not do. And the index wasn't capturing that. And then finally, we also wanted to note that some provinces were biasing the environment towards foreign investors. That they were doing so much to attract foreign investors that they were actually, to some extent, hurting some of their domestic private sector. So we made this, I think it's a mistake. We should have, so what happens, just to sort of give you like an insight into how the PCI works, is we want to keep the PCI as similar as possible over time so we can compare changes over time. But Vietnam's growing and developing and changing. So every 5 years, we do what we call recalibrate. And in recalibrate, we look and see how have reforms changed over time in Vietnam, and how can we make the index adapt to be on top of those reforms. And then we go for another 5 years. So once we made that decision in 2009, we had to keep it.
I see.
Yeah, and then we couldn't fix it again until we recalibrated again. But I think we realized really soon that it was that was a decision that was a mistake and that we needed to adapt to it. So I'm much happier with the current version of the index and this bias measure. But yeah, that I'm impressed that you noticed that. That's an impressive level of research. Yeah.
Can you tell a story of a province that made a significant change in ranking?
Yeah, so there's a bunch. Okay, so my favorite story that I like to tell is about the Mekong Delta. Because in the early years of the PCI, not all the Mekong Delta provinces were doing well, right? There was a few that were in the top. Dong Thap was near the top, Vĩnh Long. But what we started to see is year after year after year, more and more Mekong Delta provinces would enter the top levels of the index. And it was super interesting. Even provinces that you don't think about much, like Chaving, managed to have huge improvements. And we were really curious about what was going on. And what we found out was that those leaders down there were talking to each other, and that they were meeting together at events and sharing ideas and helping each other develop reforms. And so you got this kind of clustering effect that was leading to improvement in the PCI, sort of a diffusion of best practices around the region. And that was really exciting to see. Another one that I've been really impressed with is a province called Thiên Quang up in the north. So look, Thiên Quang doesn't have a lot to work with. They're a small rural province. They have an interesting business sector. They have some manufacturing and some wood products, and they also have a service sector. And Thiên Quang has started this really interesting strategy of cafe with businesses. So they call it Cafe King Zoang. And what they do is the leaders of the province show up at a coffee shop in the downtown capital city. It's very informal, and they invite members of the business community, not just business associations or top leaders, and the leaders just sit there, and every week they work on a problem. And the business community and the leaders decide what it's going to be. It's not formal. I've seen a lot of these formal, private, public, that hasn't worked. And they just say, you know, today we're going to work on land. What are your issues in land? And leaders sit there and work on it. And so there's been a lot of interesting things that have happened. And Thiên Quang has steadily moved up since it started this. Okay, my final thing is, I love the provinces that are already doing well in the index. The Da Nangs, the Bingzuangs, the Quang Nings, the Lao Kais, that continually try to improve, right? They're already number one. They're already doing great. But those are the provinces that are the most interesting because they're always trying to innovate. You know, so we talked about the Da Nang, everything in one place, and now Quang Ning has started that, Bingzuang has started that. You're seeing a lot of innovation with transparency and e-governance now among the top provinces. And I really like those stories as well, because it says, look, even though I'm number one, I intend to be number one for a long time. So that's what I've really liked. Yeah.
I see. Thank you. We should take a short break again and get back in a few minutes.
Great, thank you.
Thưa quý vị, vừa rồi là phần 2 của chương trình Tôi và Việt Nam trên kênh truyền hình FBNC, phỏng vấn giáo sư Edmund Malesky đến từ trường đại học Đức, Hoa Kỳ về chỉ số năng lực cạnh tranh cấp tỉnh tại Việt Nam, hay còn gọi tắt là PCI. Chúng tôi xin phép được quay trở lại trong vòng ít phút nữa. Xin chào mừng quý vị.